So welcome everyone, for those who are here and those on Zoom to a special program with author Galina Vromen. We're delighted that you could be here, and she's going to have an opportunity to talk about her book, The Hill of Secrets. I've read the book, and the extra copies here if anybody is interested. And I'm delighted to have Galina with us. And this is pretty special for us. And her book has been recently published. So it is hot off the press, as they say.
Right.
But since we are recording, and I would like so others will have a chance to see, I wanted just to give you a little background about Galina. And I find it terribly impressive, so please bear with me. It says here, I'm reading from the text itself, that Galina began writing fiction after more than 20 years as an international journalist in Israel, England, and the Netherlands, France, and Mexico. Quite a career already. After a career with the Reuters news agency, she switched in midlife to the nonprofit sector as the director of the Harold Grinspoon Foundation. I know Harold Grinspoon, having lived in that location and gone on walks with Harold and had discussions with him.
Everybody's walked with Harold.
Yes, you got to walk with Harold. She spent more than a decade launching and directing 2 reading readiness programs in Israel, one in Hebrew and one in Arabic, which together gifted some 20 million books to young children and their families in Israel under her leadership. The program is one of best practices in literacy awarded from the U.S. Library of Congress in 2020.
So what it doesn't say in the official, but will speak more to Jewish audiences, is it is really the Israeli equivalent of PJ Library for people
Right.
who are aware of PJ Library. So that's
Exactly right. That's
so it's we did the program in Hebrew, and then we did a program which obviously didn't promote Jewish values, but did promote universal humanistic values in Arabic. So
super.
it's kind of.
Her fiction has been broadcast on NPR as selected short series, and her stories have appeared in magazines such as American Way, Adirondack Review, Tikkun, Illinois Review, and the Reform Judaism. She has an MA in literature from Bar-Ilan University in Israel and a BA in media and anthropology from Hampshire College, all up in Western Massachusetts, where I lived for 14 years.
And where I actually, a member of your congregation, I know Joe Resnick from our days at Hampshire together. Joe Resnick Rosen, I guess she goes by Rosen.
Right, Joe Resnick Rosen, our good fortune had connected me with you.
Right.
Galina, she speaks in addition to her native language, fluent Hebrew, French, Spanish, Dutch, and some Arabic.
Wow.
Galina and her husband divide their time between Israel and Massachusetts. So I'm going to give Galina the screen. Let me move that, move Stacy off of that. Stacy, would you mute yourself? That would be appreciated. We put Galina back on screen. Okay, let's see if we can get Galina back on the speaker. Hang on a second here. Okay, speaker.
So I'd be happy to see you guys. Those of you who want to mute yourself, that's great, but I'd love to see your faces if you're not running around doing other stuff. I would actually like to know how many people have actually read the book, because it's a little different if you have, and a little different. I'll talk a little differently if you haven't.
You can raise your hand if you read the book.
Okay, 1, 2, okay.
I've read the book, of course.
Okay, we have 3.
Carol Schuster says she read the book. That's cool.
Okay. It looks like we're almost half and half.
Yeah.
Okay, great. That's fine.
So let me turn over the screen to Galina and thank her in advance for taking the time. Who now lives in Western Massachusetts, am I correct?
Actually, I'm in Rhinebeck at my mother's.
Oh, Rhinebeck, all right.
Here.
Just over the border in New York.
Okay, great.
Not far, but still in the Berkshires nonetheless. And as a part of the adult education here at Temple Israel, it's a pleasure to have Galina here, who will talk a little bit about her book. And I want to give you the screen to start, and then we'll jump in with some questions and more thoughts about the book.
Well, I think you actually, before we started, had a question about how I came to write the book. So I think I'll talk a little bit about that. There are a few things that converged. One is that I've always been interested, as somebody who was interested in Israel and the Middle East, the issue of nuclear weapons has always worried me extremely. There's no more extreme time to worry about it, I think, than right now. But this is something that I've been interested in since the 70s. that converged with a friend, a conversation that I had with I've always also been very interested in the whole issue of secrecy and what people keep secret and what people don't. And I come from my parents are European, and they are of the kind that do not hang their laundry out. And I think people also growing up in the 50s and 60s, that was kind of the prevailing sentiment, was you didn't talk about things very openly. And then sort of things changed, and suddenly everybody's talking about everything. And I think part of me is very unsure about which is better, if there is a better, and sometimes one is better and sometimes the other is better. It depends a little bit on the issue. So that's something that kind of fascinated me, is the culture around keeping or telling secrets and how people are different that way. I'm not entirely convinced that revealing everything is always a good thing. So that was one thing that fascinated me. It also fascinated me how often there are feelings in a family that something happened that nobody's talking about. That I think is true for a lot of families of survivors. My parents were not survivors of the camps. They actually left Europe in time. So there wasn't I didn't grow up in a household where nobody talked about the war, but a lot of people did. And so the whole idea, but there were other secrets in my family of relationships that I didn't know about and things like that, that you could sense them, but nobody ever talked about them. So that's something that always intrigued me. And my book is about secrets. Combine that with the fact that I had a conversation with a friend who's an American historian. And I asked him, he's a Hampshire graduate. I said, how are the Hampshire students these days? Are they bright? Are they good? He said, well, I have one that wrote this great paper. Some of them are really bright. This one did something about the wives of scientists at Los Alamos, about what they knew or didn't know about the atom bomb. And I said, well, what did she conclude? And he said, well, they sort of knew, but they sort of didn't know. And that kind of converged with me with this whole idea of knowing and not knowing also in families. And I thought, wow, how about doing a novel about secrets in families, but putting it in the most secret place of the 21st century in America, which was Los Alamos, pretty much. And so I mushed those two things together. And that really is how Hill of Secrets, the concept of it. Then I went into Bar Ilan's MFA program, thinking, oh, I'm going to write this novel. And then in my first day of classes, they told us that we could only write short stories, that novel chapters would not be workshopped, only short stories would be. So I almost quit the program. I was like, wait a minute, I came to write this novel. That's what I said when I was interviewed for the program. And now you're telling me I can only write short stories. So the whole book started as a series of interrelated short stories, only one of which has survived into the novel, but it was a way for me to get to know my characters. And then I got to the end of the program, and then I'm still sort of trying to put the novel together as my senior thesis or my master's thesis. And then I said, oh my God, I have to have a plot. And then I started plotting out the story of what was going to happen to each character, what was going to be their secret, how was all this going to work. And then I had to set it up chronologically. And this is a crazy way to write a novel. And I hope never to do anything like it again. You should start with an outline, know what you want to say it, plot it, and move from an outline to summarize chapters and then move on. That's what everybody says to do. So I hope that I will be the wiser in the future, but that's the situation, how this came to be. I don't know, maybe I'll just read a little one little excerpt for those of you who don't know the book at all, to just maybe give you a sense of the writing. It was very important to me to be as accurate about the facts of Los Alamos and make up as little as possible. The characters are totally made up, but they are types. There's a German Jewish refugee family. There were a lot of Jews who had come from various parts of Europe who ended up in Los Alamos, and there were families. And this really is, for those of you who saw the Oppenheimer movie, I really tried to talk about the part that the Oppenheimer movie gives very little space to, which is what was it like for the families living there? What was it like for the women and the children? And that really is the focus. What is it like to live in a place that you've been dragged to, not being told why you need to be there, not being told how long you will be there, and just sort of said, make it happen, get on with life, suck it up and make it, and make a life for yourself. And at the same time, I also, the more I read about it, the more it kind of reminded me of a kibbutz, in terms of, everybody knows everybody's business. And there were 6,000 people at Los Alamos by 1945, and a lot of them were families. There was the engineering corps, there were the Women's Army Corps, but a lot of the people there were families. Unlike a kibbutz, they were not allowed to leave. They couldn't go off, for a holiday somewhere. They were stuck there. They could go down to Santa Fe for shopping, but that was pretty much it. And there was censorship on letters and stuff like that. But it had that kind of small town intimacy that I did a lot of reading of oral histories of people who were there, and for a lot of people it was a really wonderful time because of that sense of community that existed. I also wanted to get the sense of life there. I described, they had folk dancing groups, and they had quartets, and they had barbershop quartet and a concerto quartet. I mean, they had a lot of classical musicians. Edward Teller was a very good pianist, and he also did a children's story hour on the local radio station, which I desperately wanted to put in the novel but couldn't fit in. So they really Oppenheimer acted in Arsenic and Lace. He was the corpse at the end of the play. So they worked hard and they played hard, and I wanted to give that sense in this novel of what life was like. But let me just read a little bit so you get a taste of it for those of you who have not read the book, but I won't do much of it because some of you have, so it's not really fair to do a lot. So this is really, they arrive, Christine is my main character. She's a woman who started out wanting to do a degree in chemistry, a PhD in chemistry. She stopped because her husband got a fellowship in London. So she reinvented herself as using her chemistry background in art conservation. Then they moved to New York and she started a business. And then he gets moved to Los Alamos. So she's not a happy camper about having to move. And one of the things that I had I'm in a writing group, and they were very upset that she didn't protest more about having to go to Los Alamos, being uprooted. And it's very interesting because we're writing in our age and time, and that was then. And this was what wives did, it wasn't like, dear, I have a career, you have to think about my career. It didn't work that way. And for the most part, and certainly not if you had sort of this brilliant scientist husband and stuff, and so I'm always doing this dance between the sensibility of today and the sensibility of then, to make it credible for today's reader that this was what life was like then, and not to make it with only the sentiments that we have today, whether it's about Native Americans, whether it's about women's place in the family, or all those kinds of things. And that was really something that I struggled with all along. I don't want to give away too much, but there are relationships of minors, and what is the age of consent today that was not really something that people worried about in the 1940s, things like that were like, I sort of had to my grandmother was married at the age of 16, so things were really different, and I wanted to convey that, but in a way that readers would also accept and say was credible, even so it's a dance. It's really a dance that one does. So let me just read. This is Christine and her husband Thomas have just arrived at a railroad station, LeMay. which is quite a distance from Los Alamos, and they've been picked up by an Army officer.
What page are you on, Galina?
Excuse me?
What page in the book are you
I'm
on?
just trying to, hold on, page, bum, bum, bum. Hold on a second, I have to find it. Right, that they've just, on page 10, they've just arrived at Los Alamos. They've just gone through this security gate. And they're about to drop Thomas off at work because Oppenheimer, who's known as Oppie, wants to see him right away. So, so Jimmy says, first stop, Site Y, known as the tech area, Jimmy said. Off you go, Dr. Sharp. The officers in that booth there will want to see your security pass again and will direct you to Opie's office. I'll make sure the missus is okay. He took a hand off the steering wheel to salute, then extended it to shake Thomas's hand. It's been a pleasure, sir. Thomas threw a glance back at Christine. You'll be okay? Sure, she smiled bravely. Will you know the way home? A good question, Thomas laughed. Don't worry, said Jimmy. Anyone can direct you to the Sun units. They're walking distance. And at the Sun, people will know your apartment. Only one unit was empty, and everybody has been waiting to see who gets it. Thomas hopped out of the car and stopped a moment at the back window to give Christine a peck on the cheek. He squeezed her hand. Wish me luck, he said. With a start, Christine realized that Thomas was nervous, intimidated even, something she had never seen before. Brilliant was the adjective normally used in conjunction with her husband. Although he was not arrogant, she knew he did not consider it inaccurate. I guess this is big, she said. She was still as baffled as she had been since those letters started arriving in New York as to why his expertise could be of such importance to the war effort. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face and he shrugged. I think it is. She realized suddenly that maybe even he didn't know exactly why he had been summoned here. Good luck. She squeezed his hand and let him go, proud to see him walk purposefully toward the security booth and into the inner sanctum of the exceptional, brought together to try and win this horrid war. Jimmy stepped on the gas and Christine tried to memorize the route as they turned right, down one unpaved road and left on another. All around, she saw construction sites and flimsy houses scattered like a trail of shoeboxes, their fresh green paint and corrugated tin roofs already dusty. She'd never noticed before that dust had a smell. She wondered if there were as many varieties of dust smell as there were of natural Maine mulch. Would she learn to discern them? Women with strollers struggled to push their charges through deep rutted roads. Others trudged along, looking defeated by the heat, loaded down with net bags of groceries in each hand. The women were all dressed in dungarees and sported neck bandanas, apparently high fashion in these parts. They wore workman's boots, sneakers, or sandals. None wore pumps like hers. On a balcony, a cluster of women chatted, laughing over tea or coffee, and Christine was surprised at the flash of longing she felt. Could they be future friends? In her experience with small, remote places, chattiness was cattiness. What were the chances things would be different here? The sound of nails being pounded into clapboard created a sense of bustle and newness. It felt as if, when she awoke the next day, she might find herself in a town constructed overnight by leprechauns. There were telephone poles on the side of the road, but she noticed that no lines ran between them. Anybody have a phone in this place, she asked. Only the director, and only in his office. The poles were put in place, but then the security guys decided it was better not to let folks have phones. Christine didn't like these security guys, whoever they were. Jimmy stopped in front of a two-story unit with small windows and front balconies bordered with slat wood balustrades. You're in the apartment upstairs, he said, opening the door of the Chevy for her. While she stared at the steep wooden stairs, Jimmy pulled out the suitcases, duffel bags, and packages from the trunk. He nodded to her to lead the way, but she let him go first. She was curious to see her new home, but as long as she stayed in the street, maybe she could still drive away to New York, to Samantha, to restoring antique furniture and old paintings, to new exhibits by upcoming artists, to Broadway plays and walks in Central Park. Jimmy made his way down and up with more luggage, sweat pouring from his brow. This time she followed him up the stairs. Standing on the landing balcony before the door of the apartment, she looked around at the tangle of children's bicycles in the lot between the buildings. The clotheslines across the way fluttered with t-shirts of every color and size. Another line displayed only diapers. Did everyone here have children? Sand scratched her throat. Let me get you some water, she said to Jimmy as he walked past her into the unit. She followed him in and headed into the sunny kitchen. After opening and shutting the white cabinets until she found glasses, Christine turned on the cold water tap at the sink. The water was warm, slightly brown. She let it run. Don't do that, said Jimmy. No wasting water, but it's brown. The water takes too long to run clear to waste it that way. You probably want to be boiling the water you drink until your body gets used to it. How long does it take a body to get used to the water, to this place? So that's kind of sets the scene for her predicament, if you will, her situation. And she eventually goes on to befriend the teenage daughter of the German refugee family. And it develops from there. So I don't know whether people want to ask questions. If there are people who've read it or people who want to know a little bit more about the background of it.
Sure, we'll do that in a second. I have a couple questions for you, then we'll open it up and go from there. One of the organization called G2, which is the security at Los Alamos, and again, not having lived through this time, can you talk a little bit about G2 and how tight things were and the censorship and this kind of overbearing, overseeing organization? Because for those who are joining us and those here, the idea of secrecy and what you could say, and the whole idea that families could not talk to one another, husbands and wives couldn't share secrets because they were afraid a traitor would get in, or that something else would happen, or that Germany would somehow get this information and then rival the atomic space race. Atomic's not space race, atomic bomb race. But can you talk a little more about G2? That'd be interesting.
Well, I mean, they basically were the security detail. They did, there were, scientists could be fined if they left papers out. They were supposed to put things away in safes at night. Richard Feynman was well known for being a safe breaker, so he knew how to break all the safes. And he would leave them, he would open them to show the G2 people that he knew how to do that. The censorship was pretty severe on letters. You really weren't allowed to describe what you were doing. People were followed when they walked around town. The whole place was fenced off. Kids would sometimes break the fences and go through. There was security when you came in. There was security. There were different levels of security in different parts of the base, and you had to have the right tag to get to get through. So it was a military base. I mean, one of the things in the Oppenheimer movie, you have Oppenheimer insisting that the scientists don't have to be in uniform, but it did operate essentially as a base. It had a commander, and one of the thing about doing a lot of research on a book is that you end up having to throw out a lot of really good stories because you just can't fit them into the plot. But one of the things that happened was that there was an outbreak of rabies, for example. Or one dog had rabies, and the commander wanted to exterminate all the dogs on the site. And some of the scientists basically said, if I have to get rid of my dog, I'm leaving. So they backed down. But and I really wanted to put that in, but I just couldn't. It just, you have to stick to your plot. You got to move the plot along. To move the plot along. I mean, the ironic thing is here was World War II, and basically you're fighting for democracy and for freedom. And this was an incredibly unfree place in a lot of ways. They had no representation. Everybody who was born in Los Alamos has the same address in Santa Fe. Their mail went through, like if you had been a professor at Princeton, your mail was sent to Princeton. From Princeton, it was sent to Los Alamos. And when you sent something out, well, not to Los Alamos, it was sent to Santa Fe. Santa Fe was bussed up to Los Alamos. When you send something back, it went through Princeton. They sent it back to Princeton, and Princeton remailed it. That's how the whole thing went, so that people wouldn't know where you actually were. So It was quite a, I mean, what is absolutely stunning is that there were approximately 600,000 people involved in various aspects of the Manhattan Project. We talked about Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and there was Hanford, Washington, and there was also, and there were other, I guess, places that were involved in various aspects of it. And so Los Alamos really represents about 10%, but that this was such a secret project that Truman only learned about it after Roosevelt died. As vice president, he had not been informed about this. He learned about it when he became president, and basically in April of 1945. Until then, he had no idea that this project was underway. So that's the level of secrecy that was imposed.
So
And
this
with
was
that, there
initiated.
were spies. There actually were spies that operating at Los Alamos. They were mostly spying for the Soviets, not for the Germans.
Oh, all right. So this was initiated by Roosevelt?
Yes, it was. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. So who do you think was the originator of this whole idea of coming up with a bomb that would defeat the enemy? Had to be someone in the army or someone in, where
Well,
do you think that thought came from?
there actually, Einstein was involved. Einstein was one of the people who encouraged the development of the bomb, much to his later regret. So it did come from the scientific community, because they also were aware that the scientific community in Germany was working on one. There was great concern. I mean, Oppenheimer had actually studied, I'm forgetting his name, the head of the German program, but he had studied under the guy who was head of the German program. Oppenheimer had studied in Germany and in Holland. He taught in Holland. His grandfather was German. He knew German. And so they all knew each other. They all met at conferences, and then suddenly the Jews were basically the ones who were Jewish, were expelled from Europe or left Europe, depending on what country we're talking about. And but they had been a community of physicists, of professionals before then, and they just knew how smart the German guy who was working for the Nazis was, and they were very, very scared that the Germans would develop it sooner. So there was huge pressure on them. And then all that kind of changed, and I get into that in the book, after the Nazis surrendered in May of 1945, just after Roosevelt died. And suddenly the race against the Germans stopped, but there was still the Japanese. But that hadn't been the original intention, was not to use it against the Japanese. It was to have, I think the original intention was to have something to respond to or thwart the Germans. And so it was very contentious, and this is touched on in Oppenheimer, but I think it's not stressed in the movie Oppenheimer, how torn the community was about continuing the project. There were a few people who left afterwards, sort of said, we're done. This is what we were here for, and I'm out of here. Most people stayed, and there were a lot of factors that played into the use of the bomb on Japan. The one that is most often cited was to save American lives. They talk about that it saved 1 million American lives by forcing this dramatic surrender on the Japanese. This dramatic, I mean, I don't know, at least 120,000 people were killed between Hiroshima and Nagasaki immediately, and then tens of thousands from the after effects. So we're talking about in the vicinity of 160,000 fatalities as a result of this bombing. And what motivated it was definitely the idea of saving American and Allied lives. The other was that the Americans wanted to show the Soviets what they had. They wanted to, and also to a degree, the question is, how much did they do it because they wanted to know whether it worked? And I think that is really, there is this, there were scientists who started a petition. It actually started in Oak Ridge, not in Los Alamos. I moved it to Los Alamos because it serves my purposes as a novelist. But in Oak Ridge, there was an active petition to not use the bomb. Hold on, I can't. Just a second. I can't talk to this friend of mine right now. She's gonna call again. I have to tell her that I can't
All
talk
right.
in a second because
We're
she's
okay.
very, I know who it is and she's very persistent.
Does anyone has a question, please use the microphone because otherwise the recording won't work. You won't be heard. Question won't be heard on the recording. I'll give that to you in a minute.
Okay, thank you.
So Galina, when do you think it is that they realize what they have is the genie is going to be out of the bottle? Is when they actually test it? Is that when the time comes when they realize that what they have is a weapon that shouldn't be unleashed?
I think it was actually even before that, but certainly then. But I think they were concerned. First of all, there were two bombs and they worked differently. There was a plutonium and there was a uranium. So
Right.
those are and the one they tested was the plutonium one. And that was called Big Boy. The uranium they couldn't test because they didn't have enough uranium to do both a test and use the bomb. So they didn't test the uranium. That was Small Boy. And I think the actual mechanism of releasing the bomb was easier in that because it was a smaller bomb. The plutonium bomb was big. And one thing they needed to know what would happen when it exploded. But the other thing that they still didn't know until they used it was whether they could carry it and make it actually explode, like whether the whole explosive, the action of it as a bomb being detonated was actually going to work. And that's the part that they didn't know until they did it. And that was not what they were, that was not, that the Trident test was to see the strength of the explosion, which they didn't, they had bets going on how powerful this bomb was because they really weren't sure. And then whether the mechanism of releasing the bomb was actually going to work, they didn't know until they used it. So there were more questions about the functioning of the plutonium than about the uranium bomb.
So let me not dispel those who are on and have not read the book. It's this historical fiction, but it's more about the characters than it is about the events, which we are now talking about the events and the historical action of those events. So if you've not read the book, it's more about the characters in that book.
Right.
It talks about Christine as the main character. And I could understand why this was a male-dominated society. Again, the wives had to follow what the husbands had wanted, and it was a male-oriented scientific community. I don't think there are any females in there, not since Madame Curie, or maybe there's very few.
Well, there were a few there was one couple where they were both scientists. But it was mostly in a situation where there were two of them. I don't know of any situation where a woman scientist was brought to the Los Alamos as a scientist on her own just because she was a scientist and her husband came along, or she came alone altogether.
In general, women were not scientists. Again, this was a male-oriented scenario, and the book, gives you that reflection. And you could imagine this in 1940s, how society might have been, and so on as it graduated moving forward. So if you haven't read the book, I encourage you to do that, and you'll get more into the character development that Galina brings about. But let me open it up to questions. Eric, you wanted to ask some questions. Let me give you this and make sure this works so that you're on board.
Hi, Galina.
Hello.
My story before after the question. This is a very specific question. You mentioned going.
I'm having a hard time hearing you. I don't know whether other people are. Can you get closer to?
Yeah, sure.
Is that Eric?
Yeah, it's Eric. So I'll tell, after this is all done, I'll tell my Los Alamos story. But just a specific question. You mentioned people going downhill to Santa Fe to shop. Okay. Was there a PX on the base So if you needed groceries, you didn't have to, you know, go through all the security clearances and get down to Santa Fe, accompany it and come back up. By the way, I know I know it, I've been there, so that's a question.
There was, she mentions that in the book, there was shopping available.
I think there were actually even two places that you could go shopping in Santa Fe. All the mostly your food and all that sort of stuff. Your basics were available, and of course everything was rationed, but not everything, but a lot of products were rationed. And the people at Los Alamos actually had more generous, had more ability to get good food than a lot of other places in America at the time.
Amazing. If there's anyone else, Tova, if you had anything, come on up. You have to come up to the computer so she can use my computer here as kind of the vehicle to have conversations. So you can say a little bit of it.
Hi, Galina.
Hello.
Hi, my name's Tova Samuels, and I had a myriad of questions in my mind, but the biggest one is, are there any records of, and did any people who worked there or their families, the children, wives, develop cancer as a result of being there? I'm very curious about that. Also, the second part of that question is, were there soldiers who, you know, were at the basic level that were also brought there to see what the effects on them would be?
So the honest truth is that I don't know the answer. What the cancer rates were afterwards. I think I really don't know. There were definitely and there people they knew that this stuff was dangerous, but I don't think they kind of really internalized it very much. So there were precautions that you were supposed to take. I don't think people always took them. There were no so I think they were a little cavalier about the dangers, even though they knew that this was radioactive stuff and they knew that it was dangerous. There were indeed an engineering detachment of young people who were in the army, who were conscripts. Many of them had been, you know, students of physics or chemistry in college, and they were pulled out of there instead of doing serving at the front. And one of those is a major character in the book. And they were the lab technicians, and they did a lot of the grunge work. And I don't know. I really don't know the answer to your question. I'm a little embarrassed that I don't, but I really have not looked at what I mean, I know that in the area where the test was done, where the Trident test was done, there definitely was a rise in cancer among that population, which was, you know, the residents of that area were cleared out, and that whole area is I think even to this day is basically off limits. There's just been a new documentary that's come out about the after effects of that. So so I don't know how, and I think Oak Ridge would have been probably much more dangerous to work at, because that's where they were actually producing the plutonium. Basically the products at Hanford and Oak Ridge they were producing the raw materials that Los Alamos needed. So they were in many ways, I think, more exposed to the dangers than people at Los Alamos itself, where they were trying to figure out the trigger of it, where they were trying to, you know, it wasn't that it wasn't dangerous, but I think it was probably more dangerous in the other locations.
This is just a follow-up, which I'm now guessing you may not know the answer to. Would there be a way today, perhaps, to find out whether or not somebody had been based there, or is it possible that that still would be considered a secret, or, you know?
I think that I don't think that presence at Los Alamos is secret at all today. I think anybody who was there, one could trace it. But I have to say that in any of the accounts that I read of people who then went on, you know, they basically dispersed. Most of the people who were critical to the project dispersed after 1945 and went on to academic careers or afterwards. And I don't remember reading accounts of people talking about colleagues who had gotten, you know, that there was a particular emphasis on people who had gotten sick after the war.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, Lois, did you have a question, you came on there before, Lois. If you want to unmute, you can ask the question, or if anybody else wants to
I
unmute.
see somebody
Yeah.
who has, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Very interesting details. Pressing more on radioactivity and measurements. When did they start getting concerned and measuring with Geiger counters? Different areas, different people. In the book, you have the Jeff that has a lab accident, and there are people visiting him. There are nurses visiting. They try some protection or whatever. It seems kind of flimsy. When did they actually start measuring the level of radioactivity that was going around?
I'm not sure. And again, I'm not sure how much they cared. In other words, it was kind of like it was a concern, but it was like, you know, they were getting on with it. They were, I think it was kind of, it was kind of both things at the same time. You really want to get on with this project, and yeah, well, you had to be careful, but because I think the evidence of the after of the impact really came with its use. And you know, Madame Curie also knew that she was working with dangerous stuff, but she still kept working at it because she was driven by it. And so I think these two things, they kind of existed together. And I don't know, I think they did have tests, and you were supposed to go and remove yourself if you had a certain level, but did they test frequently? Did they follow the instructions? Not sure. Not sure.
Come up, David. David has a question.
Actually, not so much
Oh,
a question, a comment. The professor from Chicago, who's very famous, but I'm not remembering.
Fermi, I think you're thinking of Enrico Fermi.
Yes, him. He was the one. They all had a bet, you know, for how powerful the bomb would be, and
Correct.
you know, and nobody knew.
Right.
But what he did was he sprinkled some papers on the ground next to his foxhole, which was several miles, I think, away from where the bomb was going to be dropped. And he could figure out how far the scraps of paper would blow. And so he won that bet. Another thing that I know was that back in those days, they had radioactive watches that would glow in the dark, so you could tell how. And the people didn't understand at all that the workers who built those watches were dying from cancer because of the radioactive materials that they were, even though it's just the teeny weeny specks that are in a watch dial. That's what I had to.
Okay, thanks, David. Who's up next?
I can't wait to hear what Lois has to say.
I liked the book. I think one of the things I liked the most about it was that the characters weren't good guys and bad guys. They were more complex, nor were there what might be perceived as their flaws, like Christine having an affair and
Don't spoil everything. Well, I think that I did very deliberately want to question what is right and what is wrong. And I do that pretty clearly in the, and the question is very clearly put there in the book about, you know, killing in war is okay. Is it okay? When is it okay? And the whole issue of the morality of what was done there, and what is morality really. I think that really is something that I wanted readers to think about.
Mhm.
So you got it.
Yeah, but I think in their personal lives also they had a lot of decisions that weren't simply right or wrong or good or bad, and
Well, I think that's how people
the
are.
exploration of those feelings and their effects, I thought was, as well as the this is early in the book, so I think I can say that the relationship between Christine and Gertie, you don't often see something like that about an older woman and a teenager being close friends.
Yeah, the book is very much not autobiographical, but if there's one autobiographical aspect of it is Gertie's tendency to get along better with adults and with children her own age, and that was definitely me. So that part was, I mean, my best friend was a lot older than she was. My counselor from camp was my best friend, because she was like, so that part was that part I really and I also in a lot of ways wanted to show that this was not a sinister, there's nothing sinister about it, that people of different that unexpected people can have friendships that matter. That really matter.
We recently read a book by Lois Lowry intended for children. It was for an adult and child joint book group. What was it? Tree book, something is 3 words. And it's very much about a young girl, I think 10 years old, and her relationship with an 80-something-year-old woman who was her best friend.
Well, I think, I don't know. I mean, I think people do have significant relationships with people who are, you can have a really close relationship with somebody who's a lot like you. And then it's really interesting when you have a relationship with somebody who's very not like you, and that chemistry is still there. And I think that there's a certain magic in that.
Anybody else have a question for Galina this time? You're welcome to unmute, speak up to do that.
Are there stories that you found in your research about unadjusted wives and family members, or that was all just imagined?
Oh, I read a lot. Laura Fermi, Enrico Fermi's wife, wrote a whole memoir, and several other women also wrote memoirs from that period about adjusting to the whole lifestyle there. Again, I mean, the one thing that's a little bit maybe not realistic is my character Sarah, who is Gertie's mother, is very, very lonely. Being German, her English isn't perfect. She struggles with that. And in fact, she probably could have found a lot of other people who spoke German at Los Alamos, and there was a fairly large European contingent that she, I don't know whether it was quite as lonely as I made it out to be, because it was such a diverse, it was a remarkably diverse population, because you had the creme de la creme of graduate physics departments in the United States, plus the creme de la creme of Jews who had fled Europe. There were no Blacks that I could, in any position that I could find at all at Los Alamos. Not true of other places involved in the Manhattan Project, but Los Alamos did not. But there were Hispanics, and there were Native Americans, and who did a lot of the menial work. And so it was and what's interesting is that the Hispanics were allowed to go to school if their parents worked in Los Alamos. Usually, like they might have been working and doing fueling furnaces, shoving coal or whatever, or building contractors and things like that. So the kids of the Hispanics were allowed to go to the school. So they were going to school with the scientist kids, and the Native Americans didn't. That I did find out in my research. Very interesting that Native Americans were not in regular schools there. So that's I guess maybe it might have been pure discrimination. It might have also been that the Native Americans came from villages nearby and actually had local education, but I'm not sure why that was, but I know that it's true. One of the oral histories talks about that.
Okay, that's great. Eric had another question, Monteferi?
Yeah, hi. On this mic. Okay, so I'm going to ask a question and you'll answer, and then I want to tell you why I'm asking the question. Someone asked about radiation effects, were there studies done, and I can talk for hours about radiation protection with my wife. But were there psychological studies done of the population at the laboratory during the war and following the war? Because it was my experience that being in such an unusual place had side effects. Do you know anything about suicide rates or what happened to the families afterwards?
I don't know of a systematic study of that. I know that some of the scientists felt very bad about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Feynman, from what somebody told me, and I have not verified this, but I think Feynman went to Japan and lived there for a number of years and developed helped to develop Japanese physics as his way of a certain kind of redemption for what was done. There were, I mean, the Oppenheimer movie talks about how Oppenheimer felt about it afterwards, though he, at the time, when there was a petition of scientists who were encouraging Eisenhower not to use the bomb, but Oppenheimer refused to, it's not Eisenhower, Truman, Oppenheimer refused to pass the petition on. So at the time, he was very gung-ho. And then afterwards, I think once he, saw the effects, he felt very differently about it. And I think, I think people's opinions may have changed over time. There were those who stood behind it. This idea that it saved 1 million American lives. The number seems to me to have been kind of pulled from the air. Nobody that I know has been able to say why it was 1 million and not 500,000 lives or 200,000 lives. I mean, we don't really know how many lives it may have saved. Complete conjecture. 1 million is kind of a very impressive, convenient number to justify the use of the bomb. But I have not read accounts where it said, well, they broke it down and said, well, it really was 1 million. So I think I think that's true in any war and in any war situation, that people feel differently about it afterwards, whether you're talking about the Vietnam War, whether you're talking about World War II, people who were bombers in World War II. The scale here is different, but I think the essential sense of whether that was the right thing or the wrong thing to do, you get the same kind of divisions, I think, whether it was Hiroshima or whether it was Dresden,
Correct. I didn't mean that question only in terms of the guilt that was felt, and the community was very divided. There were those on Oppie's side and Teller, and there were folks like Teller who wanted to develop what he called the hydrogen, the fusion bomb. But it was also the sense of living in a very tight community under duress, being prevented from doing some things, no phones, being in, everyone knew everyone else's business. You couldn't avoid it. So that kind of psychological stress, aside from the guilt issue about bombs and working on this technology, that created I believe that created effects. And the reason I'll stop and then I'll tell you why.
Everything that I've read of the spouses and the children, a lot of them thought it was the best time of their lives because of the sense of community, because of the sense of purpose, because it was a very safe place. I mean, kids were running around all the safe, like we were talking about the radiation, but it was a gated community effectively, right? I mean, kids ran around. There was a lot of, they partied very hard. The alcohol flowed quite generously. Oppenheimer himself was known for his martinis. So a lot of people remember it as a really, I think that's not that uncommon even, for a lot of people, the war was an intensely important and self-realization period for them, and you felt that things mattered and that you were doing something important, and there was a sense of community about it. And I think that that it had, on a psychological level, I think it was, people mostly saw it as positive.
Okay, so I visited Los Alamos, and Tova Samuels just asked me, how long, when did you start in this? And I said, at the age of 7. I was engaged in the nuclear at the age of 7. Why? Because 10 years after Los Alamos, there were other places, but Curtis Wright Corporation started a private Los Alamos and they found a place on a hill in the middle of Pennsylvania, in the middle of the coal mines, and I lived there as a kid. And it was the same kind of purpose. That their purpose was to develop nuclear propulsion, but they built a reactor, or a nuclear reactor, handled radioactive substances, and I lived there for only 2 years. But I can tell you, there was a sense of community. It was a fantastic place, but there was an underside to it. You were far away, couldn't socialize, didn't, going downhill to Santa Fe in our case was going downhill to State College, 50 miles away to do any serious shopping. And, getting off base, we didn't have military protecting us, but it was the same sense. Later on, my family wound up in the nuclear industry as a direct result of that experience. And I wound up doing business. I'm a medical and a nuclear physicist, wound up doing business in Los Alamos. And my friends at Los Alamos later had said to me, and I stopped, this was like 40 years ago, we're happy we're here, but we're happier that we're here now as opposed to back then when we were in handcuffs. And some of the old timers actually did stick around, and there was continuity. But in any case, I want to congratulate you on writing this book, because I have thought for many years, and people have asked me, could you write a book about your experiences? And so far I haven't. But it was a fantastic experience. It was a transformative experience. And ever since that time, I've been knee deep. By the way, radiation protection, the counters existed because of not nuclear materials, but because of Wilhelm Röntgen and X-rays. So following the First World War, X-rays were applied in field hospitals, and the technicians, the surgeons were repairing, limbs, and their hands and fingers started to get red and fall off. Okay, so radiation protection started very quickly in the early 1920s, and Geiger counter technology was one of the outgrowths of that. There were many other kinds of counters that came along. By the time we get to Los Alamos, they were pretty well aware that they were dealing with bad stuff, but you're absolutely right. The purpose overrode the need for protection. That wasn't true in other places. Anyway, congratulations on this book.
Thank you.
And thank you, Galina. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more question, and then we'll wrap it up for us.
It's actually two different things. One is, and you may have addressed this already, I wasn't here at the very beginning and haven't yet read the book. In hindsight, being there, growing up there as a child, or spending a few years there, do you feel that the education you got was a high quality one while you were there?
Oh, are you talking about Hampshire?
It was my understanding that you had been at Alamos as a child. No. Okay, my apologies.
No, not at all.
I was thinking you were not sure that would have been in appearance anyway. If you were old enough, you wouldn't have been there. But the other thing I'm wondering about is, well, that would be one thing. Did you find that out in your research? If the children got a quality education while they were there?
I think they got a very mixed education, because some of the people who were teaching them were the wives of the scientists, and some of them were extremely well educated. Some of them and some of the scientists also came and supplemented the education. I have a potter in the book, an indigenous potter, and the children and they went to see her work. And they went to see how she did, her firing procedures. So they had a lot of class trips. They did a lot of stuff outdoors. So the question is, was it all academic? Not necessarily, but I think on the whole, they didn't suffer academically while they were there. It was a little irregular, because also sometimes they didn't have enough kids for one class, and so it was kind of put together a little ad hoc. But in general, the people who were actually teaching them were pretty talented people, not necessarily trained teachers. So I think they didn't suffer very much. I do want to put in a plug in terms of the book. If you haven't read it, I hope you do. If you have read it, and if you do read it, I really do ask that you rate it on Amazon or on Goodreads. If you're on there, it matters. You know, the more people indicate that they like the book. If you want to write a review, that's very nice. But if you don't feel like writing a review, fine. But if you could give it a star rating of however many stars you think it should get, I would really, really appreciate it. And pass the word around. I'd love to do presentations. I would love, you know, an opportunity if people are interested in hearing more about the work in Israel. I'd love to talk about that because I spent 12 years launching and running these programs, which were a real cultural insight into Israeli community and into Israeli society, and you know, spread the word. So that is what I would ask of you if you would do that. I'd really appreciate it.
My last thing is actually more than a comment. I studied community and how and where people get a sense of community. So hearing you describe what you did really makes perfect sense, because even if it was in their case for what wound up being terrible things in many people's minds, and obviously in the minds of a lot of the scientists and experts, still that sense of community is powerful enough to override in many ways, I would imagine, you know, the thought of, or at least equalize it, the thought of what was happening in the community that was forced to become a community. So I don't know if there are any comments about some of that, but I did just want to share that. You know, it's community becomes your support, as we have the communities, you know, faith communities today, or any other definitions of communities that we have or that may overlap.
Well, also, I mean, I think if you even think of, you know, the military and the friendships that the sense of comradeship that comes in a military situation. Here you don't have it. You don't have it as life-threatening as you do in a combat situation. But you know, situations of stress together with other people bind you together for better or for worse. And one of the book is coming out in Hebrew soon, and it was picked up by an Israeli publisher very quickly. And one of the reasons I think is because the situation of secrecy and of being with a spouse who's not allowed to talk about what they do is a fairly it's not an uncommon experience for a lot of Israelis families between the Mossad and the Shin Bet and the army and all those things that are going on. There are a lot of families where this will resonate. What secrets do to a marriage, what secrets do to a person when they can't talk about what they're really doing and how they're really feeling about it. So I think the book is also relevant as people who work in the CIA, the FBI, I mean, all those kinds of places where you don't talk about what you're doing. Here it was a whole community that wasn't talking about what they were doing, living together, and that happens a little less often. But it's not that uncommon an experience. And I think it's worth kind of thinking about, you know, what secrets do to us.
It's interesting that we gathered from your conversation, from the book, from your personal experience, that purpose may take a higher priority in someone's life than other priorities. And that purpose and direction where they wouldn't talk to their spouse or their children, and you in this case, talks about the higher level of what someone's trying to accomplish that takes a priority in the human psyche. Very interesting.
At the same time, you know, I think it's really I think it's really significant that, you know, while nuclear energy in the civilian sphere was such an issue in America and still is. Yes, no, not in my backyard. Do we use nuclear power? Don't. And here, this very, very important decision about using nuclear weapons and developing nuclear weapons was done completely without anybody's discussion because of the very nature of war, and it's troubling. It's frankly very troubling, and I worry about our sort of devolving into situations of use of nuclear weapons where where we have no influence and no impact on their use or lack of use.
Well, I want to remind everybody that joined us today that this book is more about the characters and how they interacted into this society in Los Alamos. Not so much about the work that was being accomplished. We're not getting into those details. Interesting, the characters, again, who are real characters in the scientist community, not necessarily characters that you're talking about, the personalities. So it makes an amazing historical, personal interaction of how this all worked out from Galina, who starts out in a whole different structure in her education, her background, and where she was going, and ends up writing a book about a topic that you would not have thought that was to be about. I thought it would be more about the Children's Literary Award, but I'm so glad that you decided to take off on this, and congratulations. The amount of research you did was amazing. Extraordinary piece of work that you put together, and a great discussion we've had today.
Great.
I really appreciate you taking your time to doing that, and
My pleasure.
Eric and David and Tova and Evelyn being here with us, as well as those that were on Zoom. I hope that you've enjoyed it. I'm going to put this, I'm going to stop our recording because we'll put this on our website. And that way we will have it for those that would like to see it at a later time.